Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says a proper transfer policy needed. The article here is speaking about transfer of civil servants. When it comes to execution of a program, whom do we have is the executive when it comes to the implementation of a program. When it comes to the executive, there are two types of executive. One is what is called as political executive. The other is what is called as administrative executive. Who are the political executive? These are the members who are elected. They have a specific term of about 5 years. So those people who go on to become the ministers are called as political executive. They are the ones who are in charge of a department or a ministry. Likewise, we have what is called as the administrative executive. Who are these administrative executive? It can be a group A officer, group B officer, group C officer. So all those people who implement a specific scheme and program, who are selected on the basis of merit and not on the basis of election, are called as the administrative executive. In India, let's say we have the All India Services, which can be the IPS or the IAS, or it can be the Forest Service, or we take the example of Central Services, it can be the IRS, so on and so forth. Likewise, we also have the state services as well, where you will have Group A and Group B services. So all these people will fall under what is called as the administrative executive. Why are we discussing this? That is because this article primarily focuses on the transfer of the administrative executive. So the reasons that we have to look at is why are these administrative executives transferred by the political executives in India. Let us reason out what are these reasons why they are transferred. The first important perspective is in the interest of the administration. So what are we looking at? We will look at something which is good as to why they should be transferred. First up, there is something called as corruption. What happens? Let's say for example, there is a civil servant. It can be group A, group B, group C, whatsoever. So when it comes to that particular person, if he is placed in a particular region, in a particular jurisdiction, this person eventually may develop contacts with number of people in that particular constituency. So what will happen? He may develop contact with the local people from the industrial lobbying group or private organizations, which makes him believe that he holds the administration, and as a result, because there is lobbying group that exists, there could be corruption in the system as well. Why? Because corruption will make every single person not accountable to the government, and this is what is also spoken in the Arthashastra as well. So when you go back to the Arthashastra, which was given by Chanakya or Kautilya, he says the transfer of personnel is suggested as a precautionary note, as a remedy against misappropriation of government money. So in order to be cautious so that he does not stay in that particular place for a longer period of time, misuse the particular government machinery for his own private interest, that is why transfer becomes very important. So why is transfer important? Because it is in the interest of the administration. Why is it important? Because we can ensure that there is corruption free administration when it comes to the government. This is the first reason. The second reason is in reference to the expertise. What happens? Let's say for example, there is a particular state in India. Let's say Maharashtra. It happens to be one of the very good cadres. Or let's say for example, speak about Gujarat, or let's say for example, we can speak about Tamil Nadu or Kerala. These are the states which are very advanced, but there would be few civil servants who might not want to go to Chhattisgarh. Why? Because it is a Maoist hit heartland. Or let's say they would not want to go to Assam. Why? Because initially when the British administration did come up, it felt that whenever people has to be pushed to Assam, it was called as punishment posting. Why? Because there was excessive floods, and as a result, these are the states where some civil servants may not go. They would not want to go and work in a specific region, which is why the government ensures that all these civil servants work in different locality, different regions, so that that particular region is also developed. When it comes to the civil servants, they go through a long and tedious process, and they also have a lot of expertise behind them. This expertise and knowledge will be required not only for one place but for the other places as well. So what is the advantage here? All the knowledge that they have captured in a particular region, they would have gone through different processes, they would have gained knowledge as well. This can be used and adaptable in some other region, which is why expertise becomes the second reason as to why they are transferred from one region to another. Within the same state as well, most of the people would want to work in the capitals or in some of the commercial centers. They would not want to work, let's say, in a remote area, which is why the government makes sure that their knowledge and expertise is taken and is put into a remote corner so that there is development of that region. So these are the possible reasons or good intentions when it comes to transfer. There are other possible reasons as well. What are those? Let's say for example, these are negative in nature. Let's say for example, there is an upright civil servant who is very good, he is intelligent, who is non-corruptible, who is insurmountable, he cannot be captured by money, there is no industrial lobbying group, or he does not listen to the ministers if it is violating the law book or the constitution of India. So what will happen? The political masters, they are elected because they have to appease certain section, or they have to make sure that they win their vote bank, but this might be in violation to the laws established, or it can be in violation or ultra vires to the constitution. So what will these civil servants do? They stick to the rule book, they stick to the constitution, they know the larger implications of this particular decision, so they do not actually listen or get committed to the rules or the words of the politicians. Or there might be a specific lobbying group as well. Let's say for example, when we see the sanding area, or let's say for example the river areas where the sand is picked up, in all these cases, or the mineral heartland, there can be industrial lobbying group which is not let to work because the IAS officer or the IPS officer will not allow them to create a problem when it comes to that jurisdiction. It can be in forest as well. Let's say for example, they are killing some animals, or let's say for example, they are picking up sandalwood as well. In all these cases, the regulation comes under the forest officer, or in a mining heartland, it can be the IAS or the IPS officer. They do not go ahead with the industrial lobbying group. So these upright officers basically stick to the law. They are neutral in nature and follow all the rules and regulations, which some of the political masters may not like it, some of the industrial lobbying groups may not like it, and as a result, they want to make sure that this upright officer is shifted to some other location, which is why transfer happens in this particular case. Let's take the example as well. We have Ashok Khemka sir and Pradeep Kasni sir, who are both Haryana based IAS officer. Both actually symbolize corruption free and what is called as the upright officers. Mr. Khemka was transferred more than 50 times in his career, and we have Mr. Kasni sir, who was transferred about 65 times in his career. So these are some of the examples that in case they are corruption free, they want to make sure they stick to the rules. There might be the political masters or as some other body not happy with their performance because their jobs are not getting done, which is where transfer takes place. So these are the possible reasons why an officer or a civil servant is transferred from one region to another region. Who transfers them? It is the central government as well as the state government. When they are posted at the central deputation, it is the central government which takes the responsibility of transferring officers who are posted in the center, and if they are working in one of the state governments, that is where the state government and that political party is responsible for officers and their transfer with reference to a specific state. Now let's look at statistics as given by Supremo. Supremo, which stands for Single User Platform related to Employees Online Database of the Department of Personnel and Training, Government of India, shows that average posting spell of civil servants in India is only about 15 months. With this particular statistics, we can go ahead and come to a conclusion that because the civil servants are posted in a particular area and have very less time, it is the good governance which will be a major casualty when it comes to the implementation. As a result, what this article focuses is on number of concerns because of transfer of civil servants in a normal process. Let's understand what are these concerns. It adversely affects the governance. How? Let us try to understand. Whenever there is a civil servant, he is not allowed to stay in a particular position for a longer period of time. That particular person would not be able to acquire knowledge in a particular domain. Let's say, for example, when it comes to the IAS officers, these are generally called as generalists. One day they'll be in tourism, next day they might be in finance, or let's say they might be in environment as well. So these are the generalists who generally manage that particular department or that particular wing as well. What happens if they are transferred to a particular department? If they are transferred to a particular wing, they might be going to that wing, they might require a lot of period of time so that they can understand the process, how it is implemented, so that they can put in their expertise to enhance good governance in that particular region. So what exactly happens? They have to know the environment, they have to know the social milieu, they have to know the culture in that particular place, so that they are able to address all the problems in that specific wing or in that particular region. So this means it needs considerable amount of time for them to actually put down their expertise. But what exactly happens? Because they are transferred, they would not be in a position to bring positive change when it comes to the governance, and ultimately who is going to suffer? It is they who are going to suffer by default, but apart from them, it is also the people in that particular jurisdiction who are also bound to suffer as well. Why? Because let's say this particular person is transferred in 1 year, another person comes into his place, he will take another 6 months to understand what that process is. By the time he brings about positive changes and drastic amount of reforms in that particular jurisdiction or in that region, this person is once again transferred. So the person would not be able to meaningfully imply, comply, and make sure that rules are met, policies are implemented, people are benefited, and ultimately it is the governance which is bound to suffer. It also prevents civil servants from staying in that particular position for a long period of time. This means that they themselves will not be able to see what are the fruits of this particular scheme. Let's say, for example, we have one of the schemes called as the Swachh Bharat Mission. What is the overall objective? One is to make sure that we have sanitation, the health of the people are taken into picture. So this particular person, a civil servant, is posted in one of the districts. He brings a lot of change, brings in awareness to the people as to why they should start using toilets. So he brings massive amount of changes. By the time he's convinced the people and he's gone ahead with the construction, then he is immediately transferred because there is a lobbying group which is not letting him work. So what exactly happens? He would have put in a lot of effort, he would have brought people together, he would have brought a consensus in that particular village or the region, but before he actually realizes how beautifully he has executed it, he is transferred to a different location, which means he is demotivated and demoralized because of this particular transfer. Added to this particular problem is that this will ultimately mean that his morale on a whole will go down, and ultimately his family is also bound to suffer. How will his family suffer? Let's say, for example, every civil servant should be in a particular region for about 2 years. Let's say this is the number, this is the precise timeline that they have to stay. If the family is also present with them, there are children who are also present with the family. So the children will have education as well, but because of constant posting, there will be issue for the family and also children as well. So he would come to a conclusion that he is not having a peaceful life, both at the personal level and also at the professional level. So his morale as a whole will go down as well. This ultimately means that those people who are in favor to that political party will come into picture. Let's say, for example, this person is upright, he does not want to do anything which is beyond the constitution, beyond the rule book as laid by the constitutional principles, but there is another person who comes up to his position. So what has he done? He has a particular political ideology, or he is into that particular appeasing the political masters, so he does not comply by the rules and regulations. So what is happening is he would be in a position to move up the ladder while this particular person is not moving up the ladder. So the person who is upright will be given posting that which is not exciting, that which is not competitive, that where he would not be able to bring massive changes in the society. But a person who is very favoritic to that political master, to that political party, because he has a political ideology inclined to the political party, or because he listens to the political master, such person will be given a specific job role, a specific wing, or a department administration where there is more scope for development, which means again the person, his morale will come under stress and the problem, which is where we have some of the recommendations given by the second administrative reforms commission, which has already highlighted this particular issue and has said that such issues of transfer very often will boost down the morale, and as a result it should not be done, said the second administrative reforms commission. We also have the fifth finance commission as well. It went ahead and said that there should be a fixed amount of time, a fixed tenure for each and every position. What did the commission say? The commission said that every department should come up with what is called as guidelines. So let's say there is a department of animal husbandry. This department has to clearly come out with the guidelines. How? What is this guidelines? That if there is a specific person, a civil servant, if he has to be transferred, what is the protocol that needs to be followed, what is the methodology that needs to be followed, and what are the steps that needs to be followed, and when this particular person has to be transferred. All these protocols and guidelines will have to be laid, and this person should not be transferred just for the sake of political master, said the fifth pay commission. So the fifth pay commission wanted every department to publicize these guidelines as a part of the comprehensive transfer policy, so that arbitrariness in transfers is completely eliminated altogether, and ultimately there is transparency and accountability, that which is prevalent in the system. Then we also have the Hota committee, which also argued against the frequent transfer as well. They went ahead and said that because of the tardy implementation of the government policies, for lack of accountability of the officers, there is waste of the public money, which means that particular person will not be able to execute that problem in full scale, and someone else coming will have to start from the scratch, which means there is loss of public money, and ultimately good governance is bound to suffer, said the Hota committee. So what should be the way forward? What should be done when it comes to the transfers? Any premature transfer before the completion of a prescribed timeline, prescribed tenure, should be based on what is called as sound administrative grounds, which should be spelled out in the transfer order. Let's say for example, there is a particular person who is posted in a village in, let's say, Maharashtra, or in a state like Madhya Pradesh. He should be given a fixed tenure, let's say about 2 years. If this particular tenure is not balanced, if this particular tenure is not respected, then what are the reasons that should be given out in the order? If there is a particular person who is transferred, that civil servant should also have the right to appeal with respect to the superior officers as well. In case there is a particular representation, in case there is a particular emergency where expertise is required, only in such a way that particular civil servant should be allowed to be moved or to be transferred to a different place. So the representation against the transfer order should be dealt with by an authority superior to that officer, in case there is a transfer on an emergency basis or because there is need of expertise. So what is that we have to understand? At the heart of the solution, when it comes to the public administration, civil servants, no matter how dedicated, innovative and efficient they may be, need of the tenure is very important for the growth of that individual and for the greater prosperity of that particular jurisdiction and the overall growth in particular of the country. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says being petroleum independent. When it comes to India, India's dependence on imported fossil fuel keeps continuously rising. Why? That is because India has very limited resource when it comes to the fossil fuel. India is also ranked as one of the largest consumer when it comes to the fossil fuel after China, United States of America and multiple other countries as well. So what do we have? we have the fossil fuel imports that is taken care by India because of its limited resources. And at the same time, the other problem with respect to India in the present circumstance is about the escalating prices when it comes to the fossil fuels. What is happening? The petrol prices are close by 200, it is reaching century. We have the diesel prices which is close by to 80s and 90s, which is again meaning that people are the major sufferers. Why? Because petrol happens to be one of the basic commodity that is required for the everyday living. In this particular backdrop, because India most of the time believes in importing the fossil fuels and has very limited oil resources, what have been the steps that have been taken by the government in the past and also by the present government so that there is security when it comes to the fossil fuels. Let's look at all those steps taken by the government in order to make sure that there is national fuel security. Let's look at the previous regimes. Let's say for example the UPA regime. The UPA regime came up with fuel efficiency standards for passenger vehicle. How do we measure fuel efficiency? That is measured in kilometers per liter in India or miles per gallon when it comes to United States of America. So it is not only about how good the fuel is, it also depends on the engine performance as well, which also decides the cost as well as the efficiency of the fuel. So what is fuel efficiency? It is nothing but for a liter of petrol or diesel, how many kilometers will that particular vehicle will be able to manage and cover the distance is what is called as fuel efficiency. So the UPA-2 administration under the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh administration formulated the fuel efficiency standard for all the passenger vehicles. In fact, the heavy duty vehicles which consume nearly 60% of the diesel in India is now subject to the fuel efficiency standard. But there is a small concern when it comes to this particular issue. What is that concern? India's 2022 fuel efficiency standard is 20% less stringent than what we see in the European countries. So what we actually see is that they are not able to meet the European Union standards, which is 20% less in comparison to the European Union standards. The second program undertaken by the UPA regime is what is called as National Electric Mobility Mission Plan. What is this plan all about? As of now, when we look into Indian vehicles, most of us use our vehicles on the basis of fossil fuel. It can be petrol or it can be diesel as well. In contradiction to this, the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan was encouraging people to go for what is called as the electric cars. It was asking people to go for electric two-wheelers. So what it wanted to make sure is that people adapt to electric vehicles and there is more manufacturing when it comes to electrical vehicles in India. So this plan has been designed to enhance the national fuel security, provide affordable carring as well as bikes, and also make sure that the environmental friendly transportation is also in picture that is undertaken by the government of India. So what will it do? It will provide incentives both on the supplier side and also on the demand side, which happens to be the customers. So incentives were provided to the industrial outfits and incentives were also provided to the consumers as well. It also wanted to promote R&D in technology. Let's say for example, what we require when it comes to this particular technology is the battery. So what we also require is the research and development. So more money was pumped in when it comes to research and development, power electronics, battery management system, and what we have is government taking up all sorts of measures to incentivize the manufacturing companies. So the process of incentivization had taken up so that this particular program becomes a successful one. But again, there are some concerns when it comes to the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan. What are these concerns? Basically, most of it was focused towards the hybrid model. Because they focused excessively on the hybrid model, most of the industries which are manufacturing electric vehicles went up to Europe, ignoring the Indian market. As a result, who is suffering? It is India which is suffering according to the article. Apart from this, we also have the present government as well, which has taken several initiatives. One is use of bioethanol in petrol so that the amount of imports that is taking place when it comes to fossil fuels from some other country is comparatively dropped, and the government has also favored and supported use of natural gas in the transport vehicles as well, and at the same time it has also ensured that there is upgradation with respect to the faster adoption and manufacturing of electrical vehicles. So the earlier models which did not focus primarily on electric vehicles but started focusing on the hybrid vehicles was taken away, and what we have is excessive focus on the electric vehicles. Government also provided fiscal and non-fiscal incentives so that we can attract the foreign companies so that they can set up their bases in India and make in India. So number of schemes and programs were also taken up by the government of this particular regime. In spite of all these advantages, in spite of all these initiatives, there is a problem area. There is certain dearth when it comes to the electric vehicles, or how we can minimize the impact of fuel. In order to overcome such issues, this particular article has given us some recommendations. What are these recommendations? It is insisting us to develop what is called a zero emissions vehicle program. What is this program? This is currently provided in number of countries like China, certain states in United States of America, and South Korea as well. So what will happen? We have to incentivize the manufacturing companies. What would happen? Let's say for example, most of the manufacturing companies in India, let's say for example Tata, or you can say Mahindra, or let's say there are foreign companies who are operating in India. It can be, let's say, Hyundai or any other company for that matter. Most of these companies are only focusing on fuel based manufacturing. So we have to incentivize them such that they enter into the domain of what is called as the electric vehicles. When there is electric vehicles and there is upgradation over the period of time with respect to the engine, and there's fuel standards that are met, what we will have is the zero emissions vehicle program, says this article. So basically, as of now, those organizations and industries which are not focusing on the electric vehicles, incentivization program will have to be given to them so that they actually also manufacture these electric vehicles, is the first important principle. The government should also strengthen the fuel efficiency requirements as well. Two-wheelers which consume nearly two-thirds of the petrol used in India are not subject to currently fuel efficiency standards. This will have to be imported, adapted to the two-wheelers as well. The third recommendation given under this article is in reference to the FAME scheme. What is happening? This particular scheme currently has focus on the two-wheelers, three-wheelers, buses and taxis. So the article is also suggesting that the focus will have to be extended to also the agricultural sectors, which is also a major problem as these are not meeting the fuel standards, and at the same time they're not providing the energy efficiency. And finally, essential fiscal incentives will have to be provided, and at the same time, if we are incorporating and coming up with new types of vehicles which is only based on electricity, what we require is the charging infrastructure. As of now, most of the people do not pick up these electric vehicles because they are in a fear that if it stops all of a sudden, if it is a normal vehicle, they would be able to go to a nearby petrol station. But in this particular case of electric vehicles, how will they recharge their electric batteries? So what we require is more charging infrastructure that also has to be developed. So what will be the significance if this particular initiative is implemented? Consumers will save a lot of money at the pump because there is advancement when it comes to the fuel efficiency, and at the same time those people who switch to the electric vehicles will also be able to save more energy because the electricity is cheaper compared to petrol and diesel, and as a result the economy will recover, and as a result we need not have to spend too much on the fuel, and ultimately the overall impact of fuel to the government and to the people will be dropped, says this article. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about languages which are under threat. The article here goes about saying that close to 197 of India's indigenous languages were vulnerable, endangered or extinct as of 2017 according to the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger. What is this Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger? Basically, this is one of the reports given by UNESCO. It says that most of the languages is a treasure, but what is happening? There is depreciation, or people are not speaking their local mother tongues or the language or the indigenous languages, which is leading to extinction of the particular language. So what is this atlas basically focusing on? It is focusing on safeguarding the world's linguistic diversity, giving an answer to the policymakers, giving an awareness to the speaker communities and to the general public in open, so that they can monitor the status of endangered languages and bring a change when it comes to the linguistic diversity at the global level. So what is it focusing on? It is focusing on all those problems when it comes to why languages are going extinct, and it is giving some of the recommendations to the policy makers as well. Let's look at some of the statistics as given under this article. The article currently goes on to say that India has about 197 indigenous languages which might be vulnerable, endangered or extinct. What do we mean by this vulnerable, extinct or critically endangered? When we look into this particular meaning, we have a particular language as safe when the language is spoken by all generations. When we say generations, it will be the grandparent, then it will be the parent, and it will be the present generation. So all generations, intergenerational transmission is uninterrupted. So I would be passing on to my next generation, the next generation will be passing on to the next generation. So that is what is called as uninterrupted transmission, and this will not be usually included in the atlas of UNESCO. Next, what we have is a vulnerable language where most children speak the language, but it may be restricted to certain domains. When they go outside, when they communicate, when they carry out their businesses, or they are at schools and colleges, let's say, example, they speak only in English, but when they come back home, because they have to speak with their parents and their grandparents, they speak in the local language or the indigenous language. That is what is called as vulnerable. Then we have definitely endangered language where children no longer learn the language as mother tongue in the home. They do not speak at home as well. At least when it comes to the vulnerable, they were speaking at home, but when it comes to definitely endangered, they do not speak even at home as well. Then we have severely endangered. What is it? Language is spoken by the grandparents and the older generations. While the parent generation may understand it, they do not speak it to the children or among themselves. So what do we mean by it? Let's say, for example, there are three generations. One is the grandparent, then it is the parent, and then it is the children. So what happens? The grandparents, they can communicate, they understand the language. In case there is the script, they also know the script as well. But when it comes to the parents, they do not speak to others, but they just understand this particular language. That is where it is called as severely endangered. Next, what we have is critically endangered. The youngest speakers are grandparents and older, and they speak the language partially and infrequently. In the earlier scenario, the severely endangered, we have the grandparents who are speaking. They also communicated amongst themselves. But if the same grandparents speak minimally and partially and infrequently, not that frequently, that is what is called as critically endangered. And finally, if there are no speakers left of that particular language, they would be included in the atlas if presumably extinct since the 1950s. In case there are people, there is a particular indigenous language and there are no people left to speak that particular language, it will be called as extinct when it comes to this particular atlas. So when you consider India, India's language census records only those with more than 10,000 speakers, and those will be included in what is called as the language census. Now the important question is why language diversity is important. Languages are vehicles of our culture. They are the collective memory. It is a part of an emotion. It is a value system. It is also a knowledge practice as well. Let's say, for example, we have Arthashastra, which was written by Kautilya. This was discovered in 1900s by Shama Shastri. So he was able to understand Sanskrit. He was able to read Sanskrit. That is why we have this beautiful book that was translated as well. Imagine there is a particular language. There are authors who have written the book. It has huge amount of knowledge and repository of knowledge, whether it can be science, economics, law, so on and so forth. It has given a historical picture as well, which can be used in the present scenario, but there are no users who would know to read that particular language or its script. In that particular case, the huge amount of knowledge that that particular language had possessed will come under loss. So the language as a whole is very important for our culture, for our memory, for our value, and for the knowledge as well. They are the essential component of our identities and a building block of diversity and the living heritage of the knowledge of the man. But now what we have to focus is on reasons leading to the threat or extinction of the native or the regional languages. What are the major reasons? One is the advancement or the exploration of the language English. Let's say for example there is a particular person. His mother tongue might be Hindi, his mother tongue might be Bengali, it might be Tamil, it might be Malayalam, Kannada, or it can be Telugu as well. Why do these people most of the times prefer English? That is because it is one language which provides employment. Let's say if there is a person who has to work in the call center, let's say if United States of America is outsourcing some amount of work to India, if he has to be employed, his employment will depend on his English speaking skills. So there are people who are moving away from the native languages, selecting English as the language of communication primarily because it offers them employment. The second reason is also because the number of people who are actually wanting to advance their knowledge, they would require number of books. They would also require internet as a tool, since English is one of the languages which is used in the internet, and at the same time the number of books that are present are more when it comes to the knowledge. That is the primary reason why English is developing at the cost of other languages. And the third reason is that most of the languages in India, or it might be any other country as well, has to be transmitted from one generation to the other. Parents have to speak, children have to speak, the children will have to forward it to the next generation as well. Since they are mostly stuck with English, they always speak English, they do not speak the local or the indigenous languages at home. This basically means the transmission of that particular language does not move, and as a result that particular language is bound to suffer, where it can fall under vulnerable or definitely endangered or severely endangered, critically endangered, and eventually become extinct from that particular region as well. Which is why it is important for us to ask our children to speak in the mother tongues at least at home, and make sure that there is transmission of the language from one generation to another. As much as we love that diversity exists, language is also a part of the diversity, which is part of the emotion, which is part of the culture. It is part of how we have evolved. So for the sake of culture, for the sake of knowledge, what we have to ensure is transmit, and an awareness is provided under UNESCO Atlas of World's Languages in Danger. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says blow to PM Oli as Nepal Supreme Court reinstates lower house. What is this article all about? We have discussed about this particular article in the past as well. What is the background to this? There was a rift in the Nepal Communist Party. So when you speak about Nepal Communist Party, there were two parties which came together, formed a single party called as the Nepal Communist Party. We have the Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist Leninist, that which was led by Oli. Then there was another party called as Communist Party of Nepal, which was Maoist Center, that which was led by Prachanda. What was the objective of this particular party? Both these parties came together, they formed one political party called as the Nepal Communist Party. But since Oli was the Prime Minister, since he was the head of the administration, there was a consensus, there was an obligation that they would share what is called as the power between both these political parties who came together. But eventually what we actually see is authoritarian tendencies and dictatorial impulses of Oli government, and as a result, because he did not want to share power with Prachanda's political party, he wanted to bring an end to the government in spite of the numbers when it comes to their parliament. So as a result, what we actually have is Prime Minister Oli recommending the President of Nepal to dissolve the government so that they can go for the fresh elections. This is where we have one of the issues when it comes to the constitution of Nepal. According to the constitution of Nepal, which was drafted in the year 2015, in case dissolution of the house has to happen before 5-year term. So it is the 5-year term that is given according to their constitution. If there has to be a dissolution, there are only two ways of looking at it. One, when there is a hung assembly, or there is no party which manages to form a government. In the present situation, we have the Prime Minister of Nepal who had recommended the president to actually dissolve the lower house so that they can go for the fresh elections. But when we look into the constitution of Nepal, there is no provision in the constitution that allows the Prime Minister who is leading two-thirds majority government to dissolve it unilaterally. This is where the opposition political parties had approached the Supreme Court of Nepal. The Supreme Court of Nepal has delivered a particular judgment which has said that whatever Prime Minister Oli had done is unconstitutional. He did not have the power to do so. It has asked the administration to reinstate the House of the Representatives, and as a result, what we will have is the Parliament of Nepal, which will be able to continue its operations. We will have more editorials and columns with reference to this particular issue. Once we have that, we will take this article once again. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the excise duty fiscal policy contradiction. The article here is speaking about various aspects of the fiscal policy, and this has been explained on the economic survey video. So kindly look into the video. So we have two videos, 1 and 2. So kindly look into the economic survey video to understand what is the author trying to convey. There are other limited aspects as well. This might be explained in our economic this week videos. Now let's look into the mains practice questions. The core values of civil services, neutrality, impartiality and anonymity cannot be maintained without an efficient transfer policy. Comment. Next question. Discuss the various government initiatives taken by the present and previous regimes to enhance national fuel security. Have they been successful? Critically evaluate. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review. Give positive feedback to your friends' answers. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.